Chapter 1. It was a good day in the summer. The sun was shining. Mark felt happy. No more tests. School is over for now. He needed a job. He wanted to write stories for a paper, but first he needed to rest. The house was hot. There was no wind. I will go for a walk, Mark said to himself. I will go to the river. Mark lived in a small town. Soon he was outside in the country. He walked near the river. He looked at the birds and the water. Then he saw a girl. She was standing alone. She was looking at the water. She was young and pretty. She had long brown hair. She was wearing a nice blue dress. Mark went to her. "Hello," he said. "What is your name?" "I am Sarah," she said. She smiled at him. Mark and Sarah talked for a long time. The sun went down. It was almost dark. "I must go home," Sarah said. "Where do you live?" asked Mark. "In the big greenhouse on the hill," Sarah said. "Where do you live?" Sarah asked. "In the small yellow house near the shops," said Mark. They laughed, but Mark felt sad. The house on the hill was big and important. Sarah was rich. He was not rich. And Mark liked Sarah very much. After that, Mark and Sarah met near the river often. Sarah always wore nice clothes. She always looked pretty. Mark thought about Sarah all day, every day. One day, Mark said, "Listen, Sarah, I wrote a poem about you." He took a piece of paper from his pocket. He read the poem. "I saw her by the river. Her dress was blue and bright. She smiled and talked to me, like stars in the night. I asked her for her name, and now I know it well. My heart is full of love, a story I must tell." "That is very good, Mark," Sarah said. "I like your poem." Mark took Sarah's hand. He looked at her eyes. "I like you, Sarah," he said. "Do you like me?" She smiled. "Yes, of course I like you," she said. She stood up. "I must go home now." Mark felt very happy. She likes me. Sarah likes me, he thought. Mark went home. The small yellow house was small and not fancy, but it was always clean. Mark lived alone with his mother. His father was not alive. That night, his mother looked at him. "What happened, Mark?" she asked. "Why are you so happy?" "Nothing, Mother," Mark said. His mother smiled. He likes a girl, she thought. The next day, Mark and Sarah met again. Again, they met by the river. Sarah looked sad, but Mark did not see. He took her hand. "Sarah," he said, "I am not rich now, but one day I will write stories. I will be famous. Will you marry me, Sarah? Please say yes. We will be happy." He stopped talking. Sarah looked at him. She had water in her eyes. Slowly she moved her head. She said no. Then she ran away. "Sarah!" shouted Mark. But Sarah was gone. Mark went home slowly. He did not understand. "Sarah, what is wrong?" he thought. "She likes me, doesn't she?" His mother was waiting for him. She looked at his face. Poor boy, she thought. The girl does not like him. Mark and his mother ate their food. They did not talk. Then someone knocked on the door. Mark opened it. A man in a uniform was there. "I am from the house on the hill," he said. "My boss wants to see Mark." "That is me," said Mark. "Can you come with me now?" said the man. "Yes," said Mark. He felt excited. Maybe Sarah has changed her mind, he thought. Maybe she wants to marry me. Mark's mother stood at the door of the house. She looked at Mark and the man. "The house on the hill," she said to herself. "I know those people. A rich old woman and her pretty daughter. My poor Mark." It was not far from the house on the hill. The man took Mark up the steps and into the house. Mark was excited. His heart was beating fast. Everything was fancy. There were nice rugs, pictures, and mirrors. Mark saw himself in a mirror. He did not look good. This place was so rich, he looked so poor. The man opened the door. Mark went inside. An old woman was sitting in a big chair. Sarah stood behind her. The old woman was not pretty. Her eyes were small and cold. Her mouth was thin. Her hands had big rings. She looked proud and angry. Mark looked at the old woman. Then he looked at Sarah. What an old woman, he thought. Is she Sarah's mother? So, you want to marry my daughter? The old woman said. Her voice was hard. Mark looked at her. Yes, he said. I like Sarah. I want to marry her. The old woman laughed. You, a student, no money, no father, my daughter will not marry you. Mark did not say anything. He looked at Sarah. She did not look at him. I am not rich now, he said, but one day I will write stories. I will be famous. The old woman laughed again. No, she said, my daughter is not for you. She will marry someone soon. You will never see her again. The old woman stood up. She left the room. Sarah and Mark were alone. Mark looked at Sarah, but she did not look at him. She stood still. She did not say anything. Mark went to her. He put his arm around her. Sarah moved away from him. I am sorry, Mark, said Sarah. My mother is right. I cannot marry you. I do not want to be poor. I want money and clothes and a nice car. But you like me, Sarah, said Mark. And I like you. He did not understand her. He felt angry. Yes, I like you, Mark, said Sarah. But liking is not enough. She looked at him. Her face was sad. I am getting married in 2 weeks, she said. Goodbye, Mark. I am sorry. Mark left the big house. He ran down the hill to the river. He sat there for a long time. Sarah likes me. I know she likes me, he thought, but she is marrying another man. She is marrying him for money. It is her mother. Sarah is afraid of that old woman. Oh, Sarah, Sarah, what will I do? After a long time, Mark went home. There was a light in the window of the small house. The door was open. His mother was waiting for him. She looked at his face. Then she put her arms around him. They are bad people, my son, she said. You must forget her. Chapter 2. For many days, Mark did not see any of his friends. His mother was worried about him. He did not talk to her. He did not eat or sleep. He often went to the river. He sat there alone. He always thought about Sarah. One day, he saw a big line in the paper. It said, Rich Man's Pretty Bride. There was a picture of Sarah and her husband. She was wearing a long white dress and a diamond necklace. Her husband was old and fat. Mark turned the paper over. He felt angry. There was a big notice on the back page of the paper. It was an ad. Mark sat down. He read the ad. Write a story, win a prize. Our story contest is for young writers. Win money and be known. Stories can be about anything. They must be short, 1,500 words. Send your story to this paper before the end of the month. First prize, $500. 10 other prizes of $50. This is my chance, he said to himself. I will write the story of Mark and Sarah. I will win the contest. She will read our story. She will be sorry. Mark is very busy now. Every day he got up early. He wrote his story. His mother watched him. She was happy. He was eating his food again. He was talking and smiling. Sometimes Mark felt happy about his story. It was a good story, but sometimes it was hard to write. He felt sad. He wanted to stop writing, but he did not stop. At last the story was done. Mark read it to his mother. She felt happy. It is a good story, Mark, she said. It is very good. Mark wrote the story again. He wrote it carefully. He sent it to the paper. 2 weeks later, a letter came from the paper. Mark did not open it. He was too excited. He gave it to his mother. "You read it for me, Mother," he said. His mother opened the letter. She read it. "Read it yourself," she said. She gave it to him. She was laughing and crying. Mark read the letter. "Dear Sir, we are happy to say that you have won first prize in the story contest. Please come to this office on Thursday at 10 a.m. The boss will give you your prize. Sincerely." Mark jumped up. He danced in the kitchen. He waved the letter. "I have won," he shouted. "Mother, I have the prize. I will write. We will have money. I will buy you a new dress and new things for the house." He stopped. "Will Sarah see my story in the paper?" he asked. His mother looked at him. She was not smiling now. "Do you still like that girl, Mark?" she asked. "Yes, Mother," said Mark. "I will always like her." On Thursday, Mark went to the paper office. The boss was very nice. "Your story is good," he said. "Very good. Here is the prize money." He gave Mark an envelope. $500. Mark did not believe it. He said thank you to the boss. He started to leave. "Wait," said the boss. "I want to talk to you." "What is your job?" "I do not have a job, sir," said Mark. "I want to write." "Good," said the boss. "We need young men like you. Come and work on our paper." Mark felt very surprised. "You want me on your paper?" "Yes, of course," said the boss. "Yes," said Mark. "I will come." Chapter 3. Mark liked his work on the paper. He worked hard, but he did not forget Sarah. One day someone came into the office. "Listen, everyone," he said. "Here is a story for the paper. Do you remember Sarah and her rich husband? We had a picture of the wedding in our paper. She left her husband last week." Everyone in the office stopped talking. This was news. Mark sat still. He felt cold. Sarah left her husband, he thought. Why? They were married only a few months ago. The person was still talking. "The girl's mother died last week," he said. "She heard the news. The worry killed her." That old woman, thought Mark. "The mother was rich, wasn't she?" someone asked. "Oh yes, she was very rich," said the person. "Sarah will have all her money. Her husband gave her money, clothes, jewels, and a car. Sarah is very rich now." "I do not like rich women," said another person. "Sarah is rich," said Mark. "But she is also kind." He stopped talking. "Do you know Sarah?" asked the person. "Yes," said Mark quietly. "Someone must go to her mother's funeral. We need a story about it for the paper. Why don't you go, Mark?" Mark went to the funeral the next day. It was far from the church. He walked. He wanted to think. Sarah liked me, he thought, but she married another man. Why? Because she was afraid of her mother. But now her mother is dead. Mark felt happy and sad. He was at the church now. Many people were there. It was a big funeral. There were many big black cars outside the church. In the first car was the coffin. There were many flowers on the coffin and on the roof of the car. Mark stood at the back of the people. He took out his pencil and paper. He wrote about cars and people. Then he saw Sarah. She was wearing a black dress. She looked sad but pretty. She was standing alone. No one talked to her. No one went near her. The man next to Mark spoke. "That is the daughter," he said. "She is a bad woman. She left her husband. It killed her mother. Look at her. No one wants to talk to her." Mark did not say anything. Poor Sarah, he thought. Everyone went inside the church. The funeral began. After the funeral, Mark went home. His mother was smiling. "Good news, Mark," she said. "Do you remember your cousin Lisa? She is coming to stay with us. She is 17 now. She is very pretty. You will like her." "Yes, I remember Lisa," said Mark. He did not look happy. His mother felt sad. He is still thinking about Sarah, she thought. Lisa will help him to forget. But Mark did not want to see Lisa. "I must see Sarah," he said to himself. "I must talk to her." Chapter 4. Mark wanted to see Sarah. He wanted to talk to her. "I will go to the house on the hill," he thought. "Maybe Sarah will be there." But the house on the hill looked empty. There were no curtains at the windows. There was a big notice on the gate. It said, "For sale." Mark looked over the gate. There was no one in the garden. Everything was quiet. "I will go into the house. I will look around," he thought. "Maybe I will find Sarah's address. Then I can write to her." Mark opened the gate. He went up the steps to the house. It was very quiet. He pushed the front door. It was closed. He walked around the house. There was a window open. Quickly, Mark climbed through the open window. He felt excited. His heart was beating fast. He was in Sarah's old home. He remembered her mother. He remembered that night. The house was different now. There was no furniture in the room. There were no rugs and pictures. It was empty. Mark felt a little afraid. "Is anyone in the house?" he thought. No, he did not hear anything. Quietly, Mark went to the door of the room. He opened it. There was no one there. He went from room to room. All the rooms were big. They were all empty. At last, he came to a very big room. He stopped. He knew this room. He had met Sarah's mother here. He remembered everything. The old woman, her hard face, the big rings on her hands. And now the old woman was dead. Suddenly, Mark heard a noise. Someone was in the room. The door opened. Someone was standing in the doorway. "Sarah," said Mark. "Mark," Sarah said. "What are you doing here?" "I was looking for you," said Mark. "You were looking for me?" asked Sarah. She smiled. "Sarah," said Mark, "why did you marry that man?" "Mother was old," said Sarah. "I was not happy here. I never went to parties. I never went out. I wanted money. I wanted a good time and friends." "I understand," Mark said. "You were not afraid of your mother. You were tired of her. She was old. You wanted a new life. But why did you leave your husband?" "My husband," said Sarah. "That old man, he was silly, Mark. He gave me money. He gave me jewels, a car, everything. But he did not like my friends. He likes old people. I like young people. Mark, I like you. You understand, don't you?" "Yes," said Mark slowly. "I understand now." "I am happy," said Sarah. "I was sad about you, Mark. I liked you. I liked your poems." "My poems?" said Mark. He stopped. "You liked me, didn't you?" "Mark," said Sarah, "do you still like me?" "You are married," said Mark. "You have a husband." "But I did not like him," said Sarah quickly. "I want to be free. I want to go to parties. I want to enjoy myself. Come with me. I have money now. We will be happy together." "No," said Mark. "No. Everything is over." Sarah felt angry. Her eyes were small and cold. Her mouth was thin and hard. Her hands had big rings. Sarah looked like her mother. "I am sorry, Sarah," he said. "I do not like you anymore. I liked you very much. But now everything is different. Goodbye, Sarah." "But you cannot leave me," said Sarah. "I want you." "Go back to your husband," said Mark. He looked at her. It was the last time. Then he turned. He walked to another room. Mark left the house on the hill. He walked away. He felt free. I was a fool, he thought. Sarah never liked me. How silly I was. Sarah is pretty, but she is hard and cold. She is like her mother. I liked Sarah's pretty face, but I never liked Sarah. It was a good evening. Mark felt very happy. The door of the yellow house was open. His mother was home. She was talking to a pretty girl. "Mark," she said, "this is your cousin, Lisa." "Hello, Lisa," said Mark. He smiled. Expanding. Chapter 5. The evening air held the scent of cut grass and blooming flowers. Mark inhaled deeply. The sweet fragrance, a welcome change from the dusty smell of textbooks and the stale air of the library where he'd spent so much time cramming for exams. He kicked a small stone down the road, his leather sandals kicking up a puff of dust. The sound of his footsteps was the only sound besides the chirping of crickets. It was a peaceful, ordinary evening, but to Mark it felt extraordinary. Freedom had a distinct smell, a distinct sound, and a distinct taste. Sweet, liberating, and full of potential. He passed Mrs. Henderson's house, a small cottage with a bright blue door and a garden overflowing with roses. She waved at him from her porch swing, and he waved back, a genuine smile spreading across his face. Everyone in town knew everyone else. That was both comforting and, at times, stifling. He yearned for something more, something bigger than this quiet town, but he also knew he would miss the familiar faces and the sense of community. The river was a short walk from the edge of town, a ribbon of silver winding through the green fields. As he approached, the air grew cooler, carrying the damp, earthy smell of the water. Willows dipped their branches into the stream, their leaves whispering secrets to the current. Dragonflies hovered near the surface, their iridescent wings catching the last rays of the setting sun. He noticed a cluster of smooth gray stones near the bank where he often sat. He spotted her almost immediately, a splash of blue against the green backdrop. She stood near the edge of the water, her back to him, her figure outlined against the fading light. She seemed lost in thought, completely unaware of his presence. The blue of her dress reminded him of a summer sky, clear and inviting. He was struck by the simple elegance of her stance, the way she held herself with an effortless grace. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach her or not. He was often shy around girls, especially pretty ones. He took a deep breath and started walking towards her. With each step, he felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He was about to break the silence of the evening and intrude on her private moment. "Hello," he said, his voice sounding a little too loud in the quiet surroundings. "What is your name?" He hoped he hadn't startled her. She turned, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment she seemed to study him, her gaze assessing him from head to toe. Then a slow smile spread across her face, lighting up her features. She had kind eyes, Mark observed, their depths revealing intelligence and something a bit sad. "I am Sarah," she said. Her voice was soft and musical, like the gentle lapping of the water against the riverbank. The conversation flowed easily after that. They talked about everything and nothing. The weather, the birds, the books they were reading, their hopes and dreams for the future. Mark discovered that Sarah was intelligent, witty, and had a sharp sense of humor. She laughed easily, a bright, tinkling sound that made his heart skip a beat. He learned she loved to read, and when she spoke about her favorite books, her face lit up. She was beautiful, Mark thought, but her true beauty came from within, from her warmth and her intelligence. The hours passed quickly. The sun dipped below the horizon. painting the sky with vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple. The air grew cooler, and the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky. "I must go home," Sarah said, her voice tinged with regret. "Where do you live?" asked Mark, trying to hide the disappointment in his voice. He didn't want the evening to end. "In the big greenhouse on the hill," Sarah said, gesturing towards the looming silhouette against the horizon. The house was the largest in town. Everyone knew it belonged to Mrs. Henderson and her daughter Sarah. "Where do you live?" Sarah asked. "In the small yellow house near the shops," said Mark, pointing in the opposite direction. His house was modest and unassuming, nothing like the grand mansion on the hill. They laughed, but Mark felt a pang of sadness. The house on the hill was big and important. Sarah was rich. He was not rich, and Mark liked Sarah very much. He worried that the difference in their backgrounds would be a barrier between them. "I will see you again?" Mark asked. "Maybe," Sarah said, "if you come back to the river." "I will," said Mark, "every day."